Well, we are here to introduce our final speaker of the day. Now, Dan has a number of impressive titles. His background is truly amazing. I encourage you to look him up because he's an entrepreneur, he's an educator, he's an advisor. He has started and sold many businesses that are still doing quite well today, from part of companies that you would have known. However, one fun fact about this guy, which we just recently learned, he is an Adirondack 46er. Does anyone know what that means? In New York State, there are the Adirondack Mountains, and there are 46 peaks that are 4,000 feet or more. And Dan O'Connor has summited all 46. So please give a very warm welcome to the Adirondack 46er and our final speaker for today, Dan O'Connor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The Adirondack 46er, that's amazing that she caught that. Long story about hiking, a great way to spend your time. And think about retail, of course. But so I wanted to quickly suggest, the name of my presentation today is The Future of Commerce. And you might say, why not retail? Why not restaurants, food service? And the answer is, I think we can all see that the world we're heading into is one of convergence, where the distinction between B2B and B2C is sort of rapidly less important. And Neuro doesn't care if it delivers a package to an office or if it delivers a package to a home. Delivery is a delivery. And these distinctions, obviously, are less important. At Harvard Business School, we're spending a lot of time not just thinking about a lot of what you all have been thinking about and hearing about today around future tech, future business models, better practices, but we're spending a lot of time thinking about what that means from a leadership point of view. So what kind of leader do you need to be in this environment? What are the skills that you need to unlearn? What are the skills you need to acquire? I think all of you know, it's not just you, but it's also in your organization at large. So I'm very pleased to be part of that initiative at Harvard Business School called Managing the Future of Work. And as my sort of standard joke goes, if you want to know what the future of technology is, go down to the street to this place called MIT. But if you want to know how to lead in the future, come to Harvard. And so you can play with that distinction a little bit, but I'm here to talk about the leadership dimensions here. So everybody knows Netflix, I think, here. And it truly has always been my favorite case. I think I read it the first time 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And the significance of this case, we could talk about this single slide and what's embedded lessons are as a company, this fellow Reed Hastings was leading his company through a business, basically it was in the business of acquiring and distributing DVDs by mail. They were competing against a reasonably antiquated model called Blockbuster. But what was significant about this is as they built their business model in sort of the first experience curve there, over time, their household adoption levels went up pretty quickly. And as happens in a lot of businesses, just as soon as they got public and as soon as they got scaled, along came a substitute. In other words, a business model that in effect was just taking away its core volume. And the challenge for every management team whenever there's a new S-curve is one, recognizing it, like do we even acknowledge that there's this new business model, in this case streaming, that came along. Two, have we picked a point of entry into this new sort of marketplace? And what we quickly realize is that all the risk for the leadership teams is not when you're on a curve, it's when you're between the curves. It's when you're deciding, I'm in the DVD business, should I be in streaming? And if I'm in streaming, do I just go to streaming? An or business, streaming or DVD? Or is it an and world? In other words, I have to do DVDs. I've got to continue to extend what I'm doing here. And I have to find a way to redeploy my people, redeploy my capital, and really reinvent myself. And if you think about the inherent lessons that are in here, there's just so many good lessons in here that all apply to retail. In my career, I guess long career now in retail, I've seen retail in every market. I think I've been in 100 countries and a lot of those with Coca-Cola. And I think we all know what the traditional trade looked like, depending on the community you're from, the neighborhood. My good friends in Mexico at Oxxo and other places know how these markets can can evolve from very traditional to more formal retail, what I simply call Generation 2 retail. Sort of the Walmarts of the world, the McDonald's of the world, the Costco's of the world. They never really created consumption. They took it out of the previous generation. And they did that with a slightly different business model, but that business model enabled lower cost, lower price, and they were really, really good at aggregating scale and creating competitive advantage. I've been working at Walmart, on different things for over 30 years, have seen that company evolve in so many ways, both here and internationally. And yet, what I would say to you is about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it was very clear to me there was a new S-curve. And it was an outright substitute for these so-called Generation 2 stores. And those substitutes were for the first time coming in the form of a digital enterprise, what we'll simply call today marketplaces, so companies like Amazon, companies like Alibaba, and then of course paired with large-scale intermediaries who weren't in the business of matching buyers and sellers, but they were really in the business, truly in the business of aggregating and directing audiences. So companies like Facebook, companies like Google, at that time, were really all about driving the funnel down, finding an addressable market for you as a marketer, for example, and then helping direct that population to your brand. And of course, last milers, such as we just heard, but important companies like Grubhub and Deliveroo and others that we serve. There's over 250 of these in the world, according to this database that we've built, and of course, the role of influencers. So why do I mention this sort of evolution? Each one of these had their own unique characteristics. I could argue that there's a lot of commonality as you move from the left to the right. Retail in general, for example, for many consumers, the cost of goods that we procured might have become cheaper. For a lot of consumers, they did. But importantly, they became more convenient. As we move from having to go to these series of mom and pops to a hypermarket, and now to, as an Amazon, for example, you can see how much we're simplifying and organizing the consumer. Yet I'm not really here to talk about all that. All that has happened. Everything from G3 to G2 to G1 is visible all over the world today. That's what has happened. And yet what I'm really working on in my future of commerce work at the business school is really all around what I'll call unified commerce or G4 commerce. And this is a world where everything before it is digitally enabled by these platforms. I'm forecasting a world where very large macro marketplaces are not just in the business of commerce, but they're in the business of enabling every other generation of retail. And they're as much in the business of software as they are in the business of commerce. And so end-to-end, fully digitized, fully synchronized, data-enabled, macro unified platforms. And if you ask me to pick one word as the adjective for this world that we're headed into, it's the end of verticals, where I have to go this for this, and this for this, and this for this, and this for this, where there's completely unified platforms on which I predict a very large part of the restaurant business, a very large part of the retail business will move there at the enterprise level and at individual functions and applications. Fully unified, entirely new metrics of business. Alibaba is an example of a macro platform. It's so interesting because, again, we could talk about this slide for about a day. And what you'd learn very quickly in my very broad-based view is the top third of the slide, where they spend a lot of time talking about their commerce model. What I suggest to you is that while that's differentiated and it's interesting in its own way, what's really compelling is the bottom 2/3 of this chart, where they actually are amplifying the businesses that they're really in. Payment businesses, logistics businesses, including last mile, marketing services, and data management. Some people say, some very well-informed people think, that 40% of the competitive advantage that your enterprise will or won't have in the future will be driven entirely by the quality of your data strategy alone. A big part of the way you separate yourselves from others. And of course, the world of cloud computing, and if you live here in the US, you hear ad infinitum about what's happening at Microsoft and what's happening at Amazon. And I'd like to simply say here that on average, the typical platform in China, macro platform in China, is 2 or 3 years ahead of what you see here. It is much further along. And a lot of the moves that you see people like Amazon making have already been made. There's precedent for much of what they've done. So I share this with you because not only these platforms really in the business of software as a service, in a sense, and data and analytics, what's really important is that they have through their commerce model, is they have a very high level of consumer and business engagement. I happened to be with my good colleague and friend, Troy Beeler, in China a few months ago. We were invited into the control room of one of these very large platform companies. And as I was standing there at 9 a.m. in the morning, I'm looking at this chart going, well, I clearly can see Japan and I can clearly see China. What are all those pixels? And the answer was every pixel on this screen is a user that's online. And in the upper right-hand corner of this particular slide, it said 1,025,000,000 actives at that moment. Now, I'd like to ask anyone here to raise your hand if you have 1 billion actives right now. Right now. And so the point of this is that through commerce, we build audiences, and it's a question of how we aggregate and direct those audiences. And at the same time, these macro platforms I'm describing, which includes Amazon, and for purposes of argument, I'm going to put Walmart in that world for a minute. But they're not just global with very large audiences, they're also very local and building out, for example, what I think is the most important thing happening in retail, which is last mile networks. There is nothing that I can think of that will be more disruptive ultimately to the consumer and retail business than the real shape and configuration that these last miles really take on. If you open up a Grubhub application, for example, and you type in hamburger or pizza or taco, you type in whatever you want, that technology and the reasoning in that technology is solving at least 2,000 questions. In other words, it's working through lots of alternatives, and the logic model has to really solve for 4 things. Given the product that you're looking for, can we find the right retailer? Can we find the right brand if you've expressed a brand preference? Do we have a driver that's proximate? Can we make a 35-minute delivery that is within 3 kilometers? Can we be there within 35 minutes? The technology is solving enormous problems. Think about this, 2,500 decisions that has to be made in these 4-sided marketplaces really rapidly. So companies like 7-Eleven, companies like Walmart, there's lots of examples of companies who have chosen to go alone in parts of the world. And then in other parts of the world, they've said, you know what? It's really not about the guy in the motorcycle. That's interesting. What's really differentiating here in the last mile world is the technology that enables these 4 groups of people to come around a common delivery. Now, these platforms are very different. And honestly, I saw this slide for the first time in a conference room, I think in Shanghai. And I thought it was well positioned, but I think it says it very clearly. Amazon and Alibaba are 2 fundamentally different platforms. Amazon is fundamentally in the business of commerce. Alibaba sees SAP and Microsoft and others as more of their competitor, where Jeff Bezos might say, your margin is my opportunity. Where Alibaba, their positioning is, we don't want to be in commerce with you unless it's good for you. And by the way, we'll always give you access to your data. Now, we can all debate this. What I really want you to take out of this is that there's 250 of these large platforms today. We're going to 25. We're not going to 600. We're going to 25, and they're going to be unified. So large commerce models, lots of local delivery models, unified traceable data across those platforms. Now, my goal here is not to be completely predictive for you about what you think the future is. I think the challenge for each of you is to decide for yourself what you think the future is. Begin after a day like today and write down what you think the assumptions about the future are. I have my point of view about where the marketplace is going, but I'm not asking you to take it. I'm asking you to leave today and begin to write down for your own career, for your own skill development. You are going to have to re-skill for the world that we're headed into. The skills that you have today, 38% of you won't make it. If you live on the skills you have today, 38% of you will not be effective in the world that I'm describing. And so beginning to think about how you believe the marketplace is going to unfold, and then really start to think about your company, your competitors. But as you well know, in every good MBA program, there's a huge amount of discussion and thought around a couple of essential questions. How will you create value in the future? And then how will you capture that value? How will you get paid for that value? And as we look from G1 to G4, while we're not going to explore the details of this, what you can see very quickly is the business model in G4 demands that retailers create and add value for consumers and other businesses perhaps in a very different way. It also says that the history of living on gross margin and trade spend is going to have to give way for most retailers to new revenue streams, because the people they're competing against today may not need gross margin and trade spend quite the same way that they do today. Amazon, the fastest growing part of Amazon today is marketing. So they are not only just connecting with above the line money, but for many advertisers, they're now connecting with what's known as below the line money, which has not been accessible in the retail community for a very long time. I think the hardest part of value capture is not understanding what the profit models are going to look like for you or for your competition. The real business question is, if you're running a restaurant and you're running a supermarket chain or a convenience store chain, the business question really is, what will your economic model look like when we get to 2020, to 2025? And you know today, as you hear it today, that gross margins are going to be under pressure. That the whole definition of what convenience is, the way we think of convenience, maybe traditionally, looking backwards, is going to give way to delivery networks. It can be where you are in 20 minutes if you're within 2 kilometers. That's convenient. So as you think about this model, while I'm not going to take you through my squiggly, I drew this in Mexico last week, working with a large retailer. The fact is, every one of you who are in a public company, perhaps even private, at the end of the day, on the left-hand side of the slide, we all have to deliver return on invested capital. And the economics of digital are dilutive for shareholders. Margins tend to go down, gross margin levels tend to be suppressed, OpEx tends to go up, operating expenses tend to be higher in this world, and most importantly, your capital is often in the wrong place. If you're running a restaurant chain and you've just got a series of restaurants around the world, ask yourself this question. Do you need all that restaurant space if 25% of food delivery is not happening with a restaurant? It's coming out of a commissary or some kind of a central delivery network that may or may not be a restaurant that consumers walk into. So if you think about the changes in the P&L, how you get to profitability, the changes of level and where your capital is, companies like Coca-Cola, companies like P&G, all have to rethink their P&L, all have to think their balance sheet, and make sure their assets are in the right place. And that's what's really hard, is getting your capital into the right place. If you could reinvent OXO today, where would you put the capital? It might be in a different place. We might not own 18,000 stores, do we agree? We might have 15,000 stores and a different level of distribution networks. So what's the journey going to look like for each of you? Each of you would draw this slide perhaps just a little bit differently than me. But end-to-end digitization in a world of 25 or 30 really large marketplaces is going to call all of us to sit back and look at our companies and start to think about, well, how will I compete? How will I digitize? If 40% of competitive advantage is in the data and in the analytics, how do I re-platform so I have that level of insight? Secondly, in that world of re-platforming, if I'm working in a large consumer company today or a large retail company, we're probably a 15 or 20-day company. It takes us that long to make a decision. And yet the people that are growing and beating us are one-day companies. So they're using time differences and the speed that we make decisions to gain advantage. I have lots of examples of micro brands beating macro brands. They're not the micro brand is not better, they're faster. So re-platforming is all about creating new economics for your company. And then we get to the really hard work, reskilling. So how do I take this population here and figure out who's going to be effective in this new world? Because what we know for sure already, I just have finished a case working with a very large consumer company, and what we know already is that the person who came up through traditional marketing is not going to lead my brands in many cases in the future. Because I need a brand entrepreneur. I don't need a brand manager. Do you see the distinction? I need a brand entrepreneur. I need someone who takes ownership for the brand, but can I teach you to be an entrepreneur? Do you believe I can teach you to learn how to operate like an entrepreneur? It's a hard skill to acquire because you have to unlearn a lot if you've been working in a large company. And then once we figure out who we can reskill, who we can't reskill, then we have to get our organization structure right. And let me quickly say, I see this happen in a lot of companies. When I was down in Latin America, as I described recently with a large company there, it's a company that came out of an environment where command and control structures, there's a CEO, and this is a company where decisions went up and down the organization. Sound familiar to anybody? Let's take it upstairs to the big green light, and then we'll let it come back down. And you know those decision speeds take a lot of time. So sometime in the 80s and the 90s, with globalization, with the advent of very large enterprises such as Walmart, we saw the evolution of large matrix structures. And these matrix structures were really useful. They organized around markets, they organized around brands, they organized functionally, and we kind of figured out if you put a decision into the matrix, we knew how to get a decision out. The issue is when you get inside of the matrix, it's a very safe place. And the same thing that happens is there's too many people with the same power. So if you're trying to get a decision made, I've got to go here, 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 and here. And yet what we're learning is we're losing to the guy on the right. We're losing to the person on the right who's running these squads. And you've heard a lot about this today. You heard it yesterday from IBM. But there's real challenges in squads. And one of these challenges in squads is there's very few of these micro brands that have gotten above $250 million US. So how do you take $1 billion brand and put it in the hands of a squad? And then what do we do with the matrix organization that we have today? And the answer to this is something that we're all working on really hard because this is the work of digital transformation. It's about getting the organization into the right place, starting with the cultural norms, the things that we use contextually to make our decisions. So lean is a big decision today. It has everything to do with sprinting and testing and trialing, minimum product, just getting out there. End-to-end connected mindset, hands on the keyboard, eyes on the consumer, very different. You're not going to be a brand manager unless you really know how to run campaigns. And I mean, really know how to run campaigns. You can't hand that off to somebody and say, you're my campaign developer, you're my digital strategist, you're my communication strategist. It isn't going to fly. You have to have your hands on the keyboard, and you have to have your eyes all the time on who that consumer is. Demand teams are going to take over for the notion in brand worlds, for example, for sales teams perhaps, and shopper marketing, where people walk in a building like this one, I predict, in the next 10 years, and they're going to be responsible for daily demand. Not just long-term demand, let's go sit with our customer and talk about what we could do. I'm talking about daily demand. What are we selling now? Where? Where aren't we selling? Who's the consumer we're getting? And I think you saw some of this in the IBM presentation yesterday. That was just the beginning of the real reveal that we're all going to see in our companies. Data and analytics, supply chain innovation, and the really delicate balance here, if you're a CEO, is what part of the matrix do I keep? And what part of the matrix do I blow up? What's the head count, said differently, that I put into the squads, that I let them go run demand, and I let them run the company in a sense, the demand side, and then where do I need to stay unified so I continue to create scale in places like ingredients and advertising and supply chain, places where scale is really a big part. I hope I haven't lost anybody here in this important discussion, because this in the end is our reality in the next 4 to 5 years. We can talk about everything digital, but in the end, it's how your company's going to move that is or not move, that's going to be the real point of distinction. So I leave you with this final thought, which is, I think all of us have to take a snapshot from days like today. Congratulations to Coca-Cola for immersing us in this kind of thinking and giving you a chance to think a lot about, truly take in what your assumptions are about the future. And given those assumptions that you believe about the future, take an inventory of yourself in terms of the things that you think you need to do to reskill yourself, to re-equip yourself. Imagine you walk in this building tomorrow, or you walk in your own office tomorrow, and you're in charge of demand. There's nobody there like that today. And if they are, they're called a marketer. And that's a very different world than the G4 world that I think we're headed into. It's a much more real-time world. And then the one that we're paying very close attention to is, if I had 5 pieces of advice for you about leadership, what would they be? If you had 5 pieces of advice for yourself about your own personal leadership style, about the world that you're heading into, what would those 4 or 5 points be for the world ahead? So I hope that today, I truly am thankful listening today to our good friends from Coca-Cola. I think they gave us a great chance to think a lot about what the future could be. I hope that what I've attached here, or the context that I've shared with you, that we're just in the middle of a bunch of S-curves. And every time the S-curves happen, all the danger is between the curves. That's when you as individuals and collectively as leadership teams need to begin thinking differently. Thank you very much.
What a way to close the day.
Yeah, remarkable stuff there.
I was like furiously scribbling notes off of almost every slide while Ferris was trying to capture.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of you felt the same way.
One of the things that comes up a lot, we call it the great blur. Digital things cause a lot of blurriness between what were previous lines. And he mentioned one just there that Ben Evans from Andreessen Horowitz has spoken about, which is what used to be considered marketing spend or below the line spend and advertising spend. That distinction doesn't work properly when you're buying Amazon search ads, because they're not really advertising, they are shelf inventory, which means they are a very different kind of spend and different budget usually as well.
Absolutely.